Hello and welcome back. In the last session we have covered various aspects of business environment and how they affect the business firms at global, domestic and local levels. We have also discussed briefly about the trade reforms. Now in this particular session we are going to cover the trade policy and how we are going to see how it has evolved over a period of time, especially in the context of reforms, and what are the various components of the trade policy. And we will also focus on the other related policies in the context of trade policy. With this few words, I request Dr. Das to start his presentation.
Thank you. Now, in the context of understanding international business environment, as it was highlighted that the externalization of domestic economy has increased in recent times, it was found useful to actually try and understand basically how India's trade policy has evolved over the years, what have been the determining factors, and what are the components that need to be understood in that context. This may help understanding the business environment prevailing within our country and situating any business which is international oriented at the micro level. In so doing, I would first try to provide a brief overview of India's trade policy and try to bring home the basic point that how today India's trade policy is actually giving more emphasis on forging regional economic ties with different countries, and that provides the landscape in which businesses in India at the micro level have to understand and act upon when interacting with their partners abroad. And after having driven home this point, I would touch upon more about the different dimensions of India's regional trading arrangements and some of the conceptual economic and policy issues in its domain. India's trade policy has evolved at three levels. One has been the changes that India embarked upon at the unilateral level, which means that Indian trade policy reforms took place by considering the domestic and external economic situations, and this unilateral response was to bring more rationality to the Indian trade policy making process and also the acts, regulations, etc. The second dimension of India's trade policy has been determined by the global or multilateral trading regime, which began in late 1940s in the form of GATT, which is General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, culminating into World Trade Organization in 1995.
Hello?
And finally...
Dr. Das, there is a question, I think.
Oh, I see.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello.
Please come on.
Hello.
Yeah?
Right, ma'am. This is Avinash calling from Jabalpur.
Okay.
I'd like to ask one question from Dr. Ram. That he said that poverty can be used as a business tool, and actually we most of the time expect that people who are who are there unskilled, how can we use this poverty as a business tool? If we may get the elaboration on that, ma'am.
Acha, this is, I think, regarding the last presentation.
Right, ma'am.
We were talking about the local level.
Yes. No, that's a very important question, and I would like to respond by saying this, that any production process or any enterprise which renders services requires to employ people have different levels of skills. So while you need in a production house or in a service center people who are very skilled, you also need those who are semi-skilled, and also people who are unskilled. So right at the level of somebody who has to perform the job of a peon who is unskilled, to somebody who is semi-skilled who can perform a job in a cafeteria, to somebody who is a technician who comes out of a vocational training capability, to somebody who has very high skilled capability of being a manager or an IT expert or an engineer. I think any enterprise catering to any segment of population, whether in the manufacturing sector or services sector, needs people to be employed at different skill categories or different levels of skills. And this is what is there in my mind, that more and more enterprises aiming at different segments of population as their target as consumers would be able to do so by supplying to people who are employed in their enterprises or related enterprises. So the whole problem of mismatch between supply and demand can be corrected by a concerted effort by more and more people looking at this phenomenon or this strategy, and perhaps a problem of demand generation along with supply side economics can be solved.
I think this satisfies your question. Dr. Ram, you can proceed.
Okay. So what I was mentioning was that if you look at India's trade policy evolution over the years, there have been three levels or three dimensions that have actually determined India's overall trade policy. One has been at the unilateral level, when India responded to correcting or addressing different needs that were both of domestic nature as well as responses to changing international dynamics of trade. Second was because of the changing global multilateral rules in the erstwhile GATT, which culminated into World Trade Organization in 1995, that also determined the character of India's trade policy. Various trade reforms took place because of India's commitments to multilateral rules. And the third is, which is a more recent phenomenon, whereby regional economic integration has largely determined India's trade policy. So these three dimensions have to be kept in mind: unilateral, multilateral and regional, that are major components of India's trade policy. And in recent times, as I said right in the beginning, that the regional economic cooperation initiatives are largely determining the profile of India's trade policy making process. Now at the unilateral level, how India's trade policy evolved, it is very important to understand, because there are inherent conceptual aspects within that, and it would be worthwhile to understand it. In the earlier phase of industrialization and trade policy making process, since independence, India had embarked upon import substitution policy, as it is called. What is import substitution? Because countries like India or developing countries at large used to export primary products and used to import semi-finished or manufactured products, capital goods, there used to be chronic balance of payments deficit or trade deficit in the overall balance of payments, because we used to earn less through our exports and we were supposed to spend more in terms of import expenditure. And this was not possible because of the foreign exchange constraint that a developing country like India faced. Therefore, the thesis came about by Prebisch and Singer that developing countries should embark on a policy of import substitution, which means that what you need to import, you should produce domestically, so that you don't have compelling reasons towards foreign exchange expenditure. This helped in two ways. One was that it created domestic industries. It contributed to the domestic industrialization process. At the same time, it also relieved foreign exchange constraint, and therefore trade deficit was kept at the manageable limits. While these were two of the positive features of import substitution, it also had its own ill effects. Because imports were protected, I mean domestic economy was protected from import competition with the help of high tariff and non-tariff barriers, so that import substitutes could be produced domestically. In the absence of import competition, domestic enterprises tended to become high cost and inefficient producers, and also started producing products of a poorer quality. In short, domestic economy in the import substituting regime was characterized by low quality products available at high prices. Then there was a shift in thinking, that it seems that instead of import substitution relieving our foreign exchange constraint and tackling our trade deficit and need for foreign exchange on a continuous basis, why not increase export earnings? Because by increasing export earnings, also we can tackle the problem of trade deficit and relieve our foreign exchange constraint. And this shift in thinking actually was manifested in India's trade policy making process, and this came about in the form of what is known as export-led growth. The export-led growth thesis entailed that you liberalize your import regime, get cheaper intermediate and inputs, and import liberalization thus contributes to the competitiveness of your export sector, and you can sell more abroad. So import liberalization for export promotion became the order of the day. And to facilitate this further, because many times exchange rate used to act as a barrier for the exporters when they used to convert foreign exchange earnings into domestic currency, and also for importers who always needed foreign exchange for importing goods, exchange rate reforms also were undertaken. And as I mentioned in the earlier lecture, that from a very regimented and controlled exchange rate regime, which was controlled by Reserve Bank of India, it moved on to a semi-flexible exchange rate regime, which used to be pegged with a basket of currencies like US dollar, pound sterling, Deutschmark and yen. It moved on further to a market determined exchange rate regime of today. Along with this, it was argued that to be export oriented, you needed finance at the pre-exporting activity stage, finance during the production process, and also post-export stage finance also. Therefore, financial sector reforms also were undertaken, and to further provide an impetus to export-led growth, industrial policy changes were also undertaken through delicensing measures, and as I mentioned, through relaxation of foreign direct investment norms. All these combined actually determine at the unilateral level India's trade policy strategy of the recent times. At the global and multilateral level, we are all aware how GATT became WTO, and in WTO, within the ambit of trade in goods, there are various agreements to which India also is signatory, and we are part of the global trade regime and rules and negotiations. Apart from trade in goods, there is an agreement on trade in services, there is an agreement on intellectual property rights, on trade-related investment measures, on dispute settlement mechanism. If you see the entire WTO multilateral regime, you would realize that in trade in goods, the major segments are agreement on agriculture, what is called as non-agricultural market access negotiations, NAMA, that is basically rules for market access in industrial goods. There was also an agreement on textiles and clothing, because until 1995 and the transition period of 10 years until actually 2005, textiles and clothing products that were of export interest of developing countries were not included in the multilateral regime of GATT. It was for the first time included in the global regime in 1995, but it was phased out. The quantitative restrictions in textiles and clothing sector were phased out by the developed countries only by 2005, 1st January. There are also two other agreements, among others. One is known as sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and another one technical barriers to trade. These measures actually try to harmonize the standards for food and health safety in the case of SPS agreement, and harmonize measures for non-food items in the case of TBT agreement, that is technical barriers to trade. So for instance, a product like computer, if it is exported from one country to another country, the 3-pin system that India uses, that may not work if it is exported to Europe or US. So it should conform to the electrical standards in those countries. So there was a need, and very genuine need felt, to have these standards of different products so that goods can be traded and are ready to use globally. It is in this sense that SPS, which aims at ensuring food and health safety standards for food products, and technical barriers to trade that ensure technical standards globally for non-food products, are actually good agreements. But we would like to mention that the way agreement on agriculture, the way negotiations on industrial goods under NAMA, the way these sanitary and phytosanitary measures and technical barriers to trade are executed within the framework of World Trade Organization are actually not in the interest of developing countries, because very often market access that developing countries get for their export products are not available to the extent that they should be available, and developing countries end up opening up their markets much more, and they don't get reciprocal market access. On the other hand, some of the worthy objectives of World Trade Organization imbibed in SPS and TBT have been used or misused to serve as non-tariff barriers by developed countries. So on the pretext of health and food safety standards, somebody can just deny our export products. Similarly, on the pretext of non-conformity to technical standards of any industrial product, a country can just deny market access to a developing country export. Therefore, while the multilateral rules have determined our trade policies because of our WTO commitments, the present stalemate in World Trade Organization talks actually do not determine most of our trade at the moment. At the same time, one should qualify this statement by saying this, that because we are signatory to WTO agreements, there are provisions, even if WTO talks do not progress and there is a stalemate, there are provisions like dispute settlement mechanisms and others to which we are signatory that can be invoked by any country at any point in time, and therefore we should be well aware of those agreements when we conduct international business, and this therefore has determined India's trade policy in recent times. Apart from GATT and WTO, there are two more multilateral regimes that are often missed out by various experts, or they do not form a part of discussions on global and multilateral trade and economic linkages or regimes. One is called generalized system of preferences, whereby developing country exporters get preferential treatment in terms of market access in developed countries, and the second is called generalized system of trade preferences, under which developing countries accord preferential treatment to other developing countries' export products. And we should understand that both GSP and GSTP should also be included in the analysis when we talk of India's trade policy getting determined by global trade regime. More recently, the component which has determined India's trade policy has been not so much the unilateral component or the global and multilateral, but the regional. And when I say regional, I mean three things. One is that when you have interaction with another country at the bilateral level, it could be at the sub-regional level. When few countries in a region interact with our country and we form a group, sign an agreement and conduct business in that sub-regional international context. And third is inter-regional, when we in South Asia, for instance, sign an agreement with another country in another region, say Africa in South Africa and Brazil in Latin America. So these three sub-segments of regionalism are determining increasingly India's trade policy in recent times. Why is that happening? And perhaps it would be appropriate to mention that quickly. One is that since 1995, when the global multilateral trade regime was formalized in the name of WTO, there has been an unprecedented increase in the number of regional trading arrangements worldwide. And today, if you look at the structure of global trade, 2/3 of global trade is conducted on a regional or preferential basis and not within the ambit of WTO trade rules, which is called most favored nation basis. So most of the trade, that is 2/3 of trade today, is actually conducted on a preferential basis regionally rather than on an MFN basis under the ambit of multilateral trade rules. And whether you take European Union, North American Free Trade Agreement with US, Mexico, Canada as members, with ASEAN Free Trade Agreement with 10 ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia, or in multilateral or in Mercosur, where the Latin American countries are members in that grouping. Everywhere the intra-regional trade as a proportion of total trade of these regional groupings is apparently very high. And this point actually has been understood, that it is not only the failure or frustration at the multilateral level of global trade talks that has led to these regional trading arrangements. Actually, there is an economics of these regional trade arrangements which has geared countries worldwide to get into various agreements that are not only focused on trade agreements, but actually they are much wider and many times incorporate trade in goods along with trade in services, investment cooperation, technology cooperation. And it is in this sense that the economics of regional economic groupings has been the major factor why countries worldwide have been entering into regional economic arrangements. Just to have a quick look at India's recent regional trading arrangements, you can see that at the bilateral level, India, Nepal, India, Bhutan, India, Sri Lanka, India, Thailand, India, ASEAN, with Mercosur, Singapore, China, Korea, Malaysia, Gulf Cooperation Council. These are the countries or groupings with which India has been negotiating or has already implemented regional economic cooperation agreements, or they are at different other stages of analysis and study. At the sub-regional level, what is called as Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sector Technical and Economic Cooperation, BIMSTEC, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal agreement. There is a Bangkok agreement of few countries in which China is also member. India is part of these groupings as well. At the regional level in the South Asia, there was a South Asian Preferential Trading Arrangement which has now been converted into South Asian Free Trade Area Treaty, which covers trade in goods, and now it has been mandated to cover trade in services within the South Asian region within the ambit of SAARC, and India is actively pursuing this. At the Pan-Asian level, there is talk of Asian Economic Community, where ASEAN 10 countries, Japan, China, South Korea, India, along with Australia and New Zealand, that means 16 countries, are aiming at what is known as Asian Economic Community to include trade in goods, trade in services and investment. At the inter-regional level, India, Brazil, South Africa, or the acronym is IPSA, is an initiative where these three countries at the intercontinental level are forging trade and economic alliances in a very formalized manner. At the global level, as I mentioned, India is member of Global System of Trade Preferences, GSTP, and there are some talks when India is also interacting with the developed world. For instance, generalized system of preferences is nothing but interaction with the developed world, but also at the bilateral level, India has begun talks with European Union, though it is not expected that that would yield much of progress because of the possible demands from the economic aspirations of the European Union. Now, these were some of the factual aspects of India's engagements with different trading partners, and some have been implemented and some are being studied or negotiated. Why is this happening? There is very important conceptual economic and policy basis for these regional economic groupings, and that has become a major determinant of India's trade policy as of today. The first is because India does not feel that regional economic cooperation initiatives are in conflict with any multilateral trade cooperation process. Actually, regional economic cooperation is nothing but a building block to achieve multilateral trading goals. So what cannot be achieved at the multilateral level because of lack of speed or lack of consensus, because of rigidity of stances of different countries globally, can be achieved in different pockets of the world, and finally the entire world would move towards a more liberal trading place globally. Second is that, as I mentioned, India's trade policy kept on changing from import substitution to export-led growth because of various considerations. Now, when India was moving away from a high-cost economy and wanted our economy to become more efficient, it needed to open up. But opening up would have meant sudden increase in import competition or foreign direct investment inflows at the expense of our own industrial base that were created painstakingly over the years. That is why the policymakers had a conflicting objective to achieve simultaneously. At the one end of spectrum, they needed to achieve efficiency in the manufacturing process, and for that they needed to open up. But when they opened up, that would have had deleterious effects on our domestic stakeholders, the industrial units. Therefore, this regional economic cooperation provided an answer to simultaneously achieve these two conflicting objectives. Because in regional economic cooperation agreements, you can choose your partner, you can choose the coverage of goods, you can choose the time frame and the depth of tariff concessions, you can have adequate safeguards in place in the case of any eventuality in terms of sudden import surge in your economy, which can cause domestic injury to your industrial units. All these provided an avenue to open up your economy to the partner of your choice at the speed at which you wanted and the sectors that you wanted to open first. And this could also provide a level playing field to our domestic stakeholders in the business and industry. So, opening up in a calibrated way through regional trading arrangements could address efficiency concerns, at the same time provided enough transition period to domestic stakeholders and provided them level playing field. It is with this reason that Indian policymakers made regionalization as an important component of India's trade policy evolution. Third is that when India engages herself with any trading partner to sign a free trade agreement or a comprehensive economic cooperation agreement, it does a feasibility study. And it is on the basis of the finding whether economic complementarities exist in terms of Indian businesses exporting to the partner country as well as the partner country exporting to our country. When these economic complementarities are established in the realm of trade, similarly in the realm of investment, that we can invest in their countries and vice versa, the complementarities in the realm of technology or human resources, capacity building, when these economic complementarities are ascertained, only then it is concluded that a free trade agreement or a regional economic cooperation agreement is feasible between India and another country or a set of countries in a regional grouping. And these are done both analytically and empirically through different modeling and simulation exercises. In this context, it is always considered that trade and investment cooperation between India and other countries actually are not an end by themselves but an instrument to achieve broader developmental objectives. So, you forge an economic alliance with a partner country, you do efficiency seeking industrial restructuring between your country and your partner country, and through that restructuring the most efficient enterprise reaps the economies of scale, scope and specialization, and not only increase bilateral trade and economic linkages but also target the global market, because the bilateral interaction also helps in improving efficiency, which can perhaps inherently make the products competitive, and a joint venture or an enterprise, because of the market access that is available in the partner country becoming more competitive, can also export to the global market. So bilateral agreements, while on one hand aim at increasing bilateral trade and investment linkages, in the second round effects, it is expected and it can be estimated in which country how much that effect will be. In the second round effect, which can be estimated, it is possible to use these FTAs to target the global market. Another dimension is that not only trade and investments are instruments to achieve developmental objectives, but also trade and investments are interlinked. So the emphasis is trade creating joint ventures, or investments many times are made because trade flows necessitated that kind of an investment. So trade and investments are linked, and it is in this context that there is a whole concept of vertical integration and horizontal specialization of enterprises, where you distribute different stages of values chain or production processes between yourself and the partner countries, and that distribution of production chain helps you specialize and reap economies of scale, and then through computer integrated manufacturing, CIM, or computer aided designing, whatever the case be, you blend your production processes in such a manner that not only that you are able to trade between yourself, but you actually target the global market. Then the whole issue of trade in services needs to be understood, that how trade in goods cooperation through an FTA between India and another partner, getting linked with joint ventures and investment cooperation that is essentially trade creating, also has important implications for trade in services. For instance, trade in goods cannot take place unless certain trade in services also take place. Just to give an example, if India wants to export a product X to her partner, it needs to actually resort to some shipping services. So trade in goods actually engender trade in services, and vice versa. Many times when you trade in services, trade in goods actually get engendered. For instance, Maldives is a major tourist destination. It exports tourism, which is a service. But to export tourism, they have to build resorts. And to build resorts, you need construction materials, you need hotel infrastructure, you need perhaps textile items, you need cutlery. So when you export a services sector segment, you also generate trade in goods. The short point here is that trade is linked with investment, and these two are linked with trade in services. And a holistic and integrated view of interlinkages between trade and in goods with investment and trade in services, and realizing that these three interact in a dual manner because each cause the other one and also get caused by the other one. This dual causality among these three actually needs to be understood in an integrated manner, and this becomes further basis and provides an economic justification for actually forging economic alliances on a regional or bilateral basis. Further, these also contribute to technology cooperation, because a product traded on a preferential basis also helps trade a level of technology through the product. A product embodies technology, and there have been empirical evidences where we have found how trade in goods facilitated between countries have also facilitated technology cooperation between two countries. One more point needs to be mentioned when we try to understand the economics of these FTAs and how that has actually contributed also to making it as an important component of India's trade policy making. And that is static and dynamic gains. Usually, when a free trade agreement is signed, the tariffs for, say, India's exports are lowered in the partner country. And to that extent, India can export more to the partner country. Now, this increase in export because of increased market access, because of lower tariff within a free trade agreement is a static gain at a point of time. But over a period of time, this static gain starts getting converted into dynamic gains. And how does this happen? It happens something like this, that when tariffs have been brought down by the partner country under a free trade agreement, which means greater market access for the partner country, you can export more. Now, because of this ability to export more, you can increase your production capacity. You can expand the scale of operation. When you expand the scale of operation, you start reaping the economies of scale. When you start reaping the economies of scale, your per unit cost of production goes down, which means in a dynamic setting, your products become inherently more efficient and competitive. So what started as a static export gain because of tariff liberalization gets converted into a dynamic gain via the route of economies of scale, whereby your export product becomes inherently competitive, and now when it has become inherently more competitive, it can be exported more and more to the partner country, surely, but also to the global market. And this was the logic when I said that the economic complementarities are actually assessed, and they are assessed both in a static and dynamic sense. This was another important dimension of why these free trade agreements are signed and executed and implemented. Having said this, when you open up along with your partner country, you provide reciprocal market access, there are certain negotiating issues in the realms of rules of origin. Perhaps the time would not permit to go into their details. There are concerns regarding the mutual recognition arrangements. There are concerns relating to health and food safety standards, the technical standards when the products cross the borders, which I mentioned are already there at the WTO level, or the threat to domestic industry due to sudden import surge, or also the threat to domestic industry due to unfair trading practices like dumping in your economy, or your partner country excessively unfairly providing export subsidies to its enterprises and they can sell in your market at a cheaper price. For all these unfair trade practices like dumping and countervailing duties, we have safeguard measures, and also for fair trade practices where even if sudden surge in imports are there by the partner country, certain safeguard measures are always kept in a free trade agreement. That brings me to the final point, that these free trade agreements, while they try to capitalize on the positives of the economics of these, they also set in place certain safeguard measures, and international business perhaps in this context can be viewed in a very balanced manner. I think that was about all, and this is the sum and substance of the major component of India's trade policy, which is now getting geared by the Regional Economic Cooperation Agreement. Thank you for your attention.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Das. So far we have given the overview of India's trade policy and what are the various components and dimensions deciding this trade policy, and about the regional trade groupings, and how the import liberalization for export growth has become the order of the day, which necessitated huge finances, which in turn calls for financial sector reforms. This is what we have basically covered. Then we went on discussing about the global and multilateral agreements, how important to be aware of such agreements, especially in the context of WTO agreements regarding food and product standards, regional trade groupings and economic trade cooperation for achieving trade goals, and again how trade and investment, trade in goods and services, how these three are interrelated. You have very well covered. Thank you very much. And with this we come to the close of this session, today's teleconferencing. Thank you.
Namaskar friends and viewers. Now we are going to discuss objectivity in history writing. That is our topic. I am S.B. Upadhyay from History Faculty, School of Social Sciences, IGNOU. I am going to introduce the concept of objectivity and see how it applies to the writing of history as well as the social sciences in general. Objectivity, you must have heard about it. We generally refer to objectivity in our day-to-day life that this view is not objective, this view is subjective. So the antonym, the opposite of the objective, we generally use as subjective, and we generally take the objective to be true, to be the right approach in social sciences. And that is the foundation on which social sciences in general and history in particular have been built. Here we are going to discuss how this foundation functions, how it arose, how this theory of objectivity came into being, and how its critiques developed over the years. Objectivity is the founding principle of Western historiographical tradition. When I mean the Western historiographical tradition, when I say that, it means that the tradition of history writing which started from ancient Greece. So it's the Greco-Roman tradition which developed into medieval period in the Western Europe, and